Good morning to all of you. I'm very pleased to be part of this Shannon lecture series, and I want to thank you all for joining me today. Of course, I would have liked to be here with you in person, but if I look back at wonderful Ed's lecture of last week, I don't think that physical distance will be a hindrance to our intellectual exchanges. And before I begin, I really want to thank Dominique Marshall for inviting me, but also for commitment to creating community among researchers from different backgrounds. Thanks also to Emma Fraser and Aislinn Cogill for the organization of that series in that specific context we are living in. So to begin with, I want to start by addressing the central question of my lecture today by stating that issues related to human rights and minority rights in Quebec are complex in the context where many Quebecers define themselves as a member of minority. Recent debates about reasonable accommodation, the Charter of Values, among others, have shown a strong tendency in Quebec to oppose minority and human rights to the so-called collective rights of Quebecers. And despite the impressive number of recent events which reveal the deep impact of systemic racism in that province, many Quebecers still refuse to address these issues while arguing that Quebecers and French Canadians were historically the main victims of racism, discrimination, and even colonialism in Canada. At the same time, Quebec also has a strong human rights tradition that is symbolized by the 1975 Charter of Rights, a document which is considered by several jurists as one of the most progressive in North America. Historians in the field of human rights in Canada have paid little attention to Quebec, particularly because of the language barrier, which I understand really well if you can hear my French accent, but also the way I'm forced to look at my text right now, so I'm sorry about this. The few historians who have looked at the history of human rights in Quebec I've pointed out that the Catholicism, nationalism, illiberalism, and of French Canadians have meant that they have been absent from the post-war human rights movement. And I put here two quotes from Russ Lambertson and Christopher McLennan's book, who are among the most important studies of the 1940s and 50s debates on human rights in Canada. As a historian of contemporary Quebec, I wanted to give a kind of a more profound and complex insight on this largely unknown history of human rights thinking and practice in Quebec during the years that following the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 to the really beginning of the 1960s. To be sure, my lecture today is not intended to demonstrate the presence of French Canadian and post-war human rights struggles, but to highlight the complexity of the debates of these about the recognition of these rights in the singular context of Quebec. So to do so, I will focus on the trajectories of some activists from an organization that was at the forefront of social contest in post-war Quebec, the Canadian Catholic Confederation of Labor, which I'll refer later to the French acronym Ctcc. I must mention that this lecture is a work in progress, so please feel free to ask any question or make any comments or critics that can improve my work and my thinking about this complexity. So through this specific case, I want to demonstrate some crucial dynamics of human rights debates in post-war Quebec. And first, the profound influence of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, but also of NGOs involved in promotion of human rights internationally. Secondly, I will look at some, at the way the debates on human rights were influenced by local context, including the presence of a conservative Prime Minister, Maurice Duplessis, that you probably heard of, the profound influence of Catholic culture, and also the interconnected debates about race and French Canadians' rights. And finally, I want to engage a more broader reflection about the way in which mobilization of human rights, despite the claims to universality, are all structured by ideological, strategic, but also identity-based factors. So this case study reveals the profound diversity of conception of human rights that coexisted in Quebec and in the world in the post-war, and demonstrate, in the words of the human rights theorist Upendra Baxi, that there is not one world of human rights, but many conflicted worlds. So my presentation today is divided in three sections, in which in the first one I will look at the Universal Declaration and post-war international movement influence on Quebec. The second one will be on local struggles for civil liberties and workers' rights that were framed in human rights discourse. And at the end, I will look at the somewhat problematic position adopted by the Ctcc regarding racial and religious discrimination in the 50s and early beginning of the 60s. So the Canadian Catholic Confederation of Labour was created in 1921 to counter the influence of what is called international unions in Quebec, which are affiliated to the AFL-CIO in the United States. In 1950, this federation grouped 90,000 workers, so the third of unionized workers of that province. The vast majority of these workers were French-speaking and Catholics, but the reality is that the archive doesn't allow me to estimate the real number of members who belong to ethnic and racialized groups, especially because the notion of race is often used in the 50s to identify non-racialized persons. So this is a real crucial obstacles to my work. But what is sure is that in the 50s, the vast majority of its elected leadership were male, white Francophones, and Catholic, and that the organization has only few ties with Jewish communities and no relation at all with racialized communities here in Quebec. This organization differs from the so-called international unions because its constitution refers directly to the teaching of the church. It is also supervised by Catholic chaplains, and some permanent positions of the organization were reserved to Catholics until 1960, when the Ctcc was secularized and renamed Confederation of National Trade Unions, and I will use the French acronym CSN. So in Canada, we know quite well the role played by the so-called international unions in post-war human rights struggles, but we know little about their role in Quebec, and we know almost nothing about the place of Catholic Union human rights in the human rights networks that were created in the post-war in Quebec, in Canada, and internationally. So the first thing that strikes me when I was doing my research for my thesis is that actors from virtually all sectors of Quebec's civil society were engaged in local debates about the universal rights, and that these debates often reflect the discussion that were going on at the global level. So I often use the metaphor of a mirror or the concept of global-local dialectic. And before the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, Catholic labor activists in Quebec were largely suspicious about the United Nations, the UN, because this organization was composed only from delegates from governments. Ctcc mainly found its post-war reconstruction plan on the principle established by International Labour Organization, which is a kind of a labor branch of the UN. The ILO, International Labour Organization, is formed by governments, employers, but also labor representatives. So the structure of this organization was more in phase with the dominant Catholic conception of democracy of the time, which was based on the cooperation between labor and capital in the quest for public good. The Ctcc members early supported the principle established by the ILO, which they define as human rights, also because its delegates have been involved in ILO's debate since 1924 through their participation in the Canadian delegation. So each year during the 40s and 50s, its delegates traveled to Europe to attend ILO conference in Geneva, where they managed to build international alliance with some of the most influential Catholic labor activists, especially from France and Belgium. So you have a picture here of the President Gérard Picard in 1954. And as we will see, the International Labour Organization is also a place where union activists can bring local human rights violation into the world arena. In the post-war, the Ctcc was also involved in international affairs through its affiliation to an organization called the International Confederation of Christian Trade Unions, which I refer shortly to International Confederation. In 1947, the Ctcc became the first non-European organization to join the International Confederation, which in the late 50s brought together 2 million workers, mainly from Europe. this organization had a consultative status at the UN and at the ILO, and strongly support the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN commitment to what I quote, for the respect of the human persona, his dignity and his rights. The leaders also came to Quebec on a regular basis to make addresses to Ctcc's annual conference. And here you have the Gaston Tessier, the president. And every time they addressed to Catholic workers in Canada, they stressed the important role played by their organization in the drafting of what they called the Workers' Great Charter of 1948, in reference to the Universal Declaration, which in their minds has its roots in Christian universalism. So since 1948, Ctcc's member support with only marginal objection a large part of the principle established by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in 1951, its members adopted a new declaration of principles that reflect some of the new norms established by the UN in terms of civil liberties, workers' rights, and mainly economic, social, and cultural rights. And this declaration also affirms that Catholic unions oppose, I quote, to unjust treatment on the basis of language, nationality, race, sex, and religion. I want to say that I put aside today the question of gender and sex discrimination, which is a crucial question in the post-war. Maybe if, we can get back to it in the Q&A period. So this was the international influence, but if you go to the local level, the international law and the UN bodies were mainly mobilized by Catholic activists in their opposition to repressive measures adopted by Prime Minister Duplessis, who was at the head of a conservative government from 1944 until his death in 1959, so during all the 50s. So for instance, in 1949, it took place in the Estrie region in Quebec, a big strike that is known as Asbestos Strike. And the strike involved 5,000 workers and lasted 4 months. And in May, the provincial police pronounced the Riot Act and arrested, brutalized, and imprisoned several strikers and union leaders under the authority of Duplessis, who was at the time Attorney General of the province of Quebec. So like many human rights activists in the world, this direct confrontation with violence and abuse of their own dignity was the primary source of their mobilization of human rights discourse. And in May 1949, the leaders of the Ctcc, including Jean Marchand, Gérard Pelletier, Gérard Picard, the president, and others, asked the federal government to set up a commission of inquiry based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Also, they mobilized their relations with Christian Union activists in Europe to bring the asbestos case to the attention of international community. So that year, the situation in asbestos was discussed in Catholic Union Congress in France and Belgium. And in his address to the International Labour Organization Conference in Geneva, the president of the International Confederation of Christian Unions, Gaston Tessier, denounced the repression that was raging both in Duplessis regime and also in Franco Spain. That illustrates that at the time, many Ctcc's leaders start referring to the Duplessis regime as a fascist dictatorship and reactivate the discourse about the sacrifice made during the World War II by free will against the Nazi and fascist dictatorship. In 1957, during the Murdochville strike, which involves the so-called international unions, Ctcc led a 7,000 workers' march in Quebec and called for an investigation of the International Labour Organization in Quebec, which mandate will be, I quote, to ensure universal respect for human rights. So it is in that context of repression that Ctcc's members created the first Human Rights Committee of the Ctcc in 1954, which was mandated to prepare a draft of a human rights charter to be included in the Canadian Constitution. And I must mention that Gaston Tessier were present at the Congress where he gave a long speech about the role of Catholics in the world to promote human rights, especially in the wake of Cold War. But what is absolutely fascinating about the mid-50s is that how the Universal Declaration became one of the main framing discourse of the activists engaged in the struggles against Duplessis. So for instance, industrial unions in Quebec which leadership was mainly Francophone, published in 1955 the Manifeste au Peuple du Québec, which is based entirely on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and also many democratic, liberal, socialist groups. Here I give the example of the Union des Forces Démocratiques, who was created by Pierre Trudeau in 1958, also rely heavily on the Universal Declaration, which became a kind of networking tool for many activists at the time. Another crucial aspect of the engagement of the Ctcc in the 50s is that the UN rights norms were also mobilized to claim the protection of certain economic, social, and cultural rights. So from the 50s and on, Catholic trade unions present many briefs on the rights to health, to education, and to social security, which all rely on the principle established in the Universal Declaration, in International Labour Organization, and also in UNESCO about the right to education. And like many Catholics at the time around the world, Ctcc's member also drew on the writings of philosophers associated with a current known as personalism. Since the 1930s, Catholic personalists, intellectuals, and activists such as Jacques Maritain and Emmanuel Mounier that I show here on the slide, have attempted to kind of reconciliate Catholicism with the ideal of droit de l'homme by promoting certain economic and social rights designed to counter the hegemony of what they call the individualistic, atheist, and materialist conception of rights that is embedded in liberal tradition. So I don't have time here to elaborate more on personalism, but this has a profound influence on debates about human rights in Quebec, and also have direct affiliation with the Quebec Charter of Rights of 1975, which title used the neologism of droit de la personne, and also affirms the universality of social rights. So it's not exaggerated to state that Catholic Union activists have played a leading role in the dissemination of human rights ideas in post-war Quebec, especially among Francophone and Catholic. But as an historian, what is really interesting to try to understand about human rights activism in general is the discrepancies that often exist between their universalistic discourse and the concrete reality of their practice. So in the case of Catholic Union, this contradiction is obvious in many issues, including the padlock law, Jehovah's Witnesses, censorship, family, gender, morality, and many more. But the clearest manifestation of that contradiction is the complete disengagement of its member during the first decade of following World War II in the fight against racial and religious discrimination. There are so many reasons for this disengagement and this really complex question, but I think it can be explained by ideology, but also by strategic and identity-based factors. First of all, many French Canadians share a specific conception of race in the post-war, inherited from the 19th century, which was strongly articulated around the relationship between Anglo-Protestant and French Catholic Canadians. And to illustrate this conception, I've put here a map produced by the City of Montreal in 1934, which clearly reveals how categories of race is closely related to language and religion. This articulation of race, language, religion has profound influence on debates about racial discrimination until today, by masking the reality of racism and perpetuating the myth of a racelessness nation. So during the first decade of the post-war, Catholic labor activists focused exclusively on discrimination faced by Catholic Francophone in Canada, which they frame as human rights violation, but also as racial discrimination. I must say that this conception is not only a French-Canadian one. In the post-war, the vast majority of the debates about racism in Quebec focused on the question of anti-Semitism and not on the discrimination faced by racialized groups in Quebec. More largely, I can state that only very few white activists until the end of the 50s have addressed issues related to Indigenous rights, Canadian colonialism, systemic racism, afterlife of slavery, and other. In fact, the reality of colonialism and systemic racism was in some sort subsumed by the abstract discourse on the universality of rights. So this disengagement of the Ctcc is also related to a fundamental tension that exists between its universalistic human rights discourse and the ethnic and religious identity of this organization. So this tension was at stake in many Catholic and nationalist circles in the 50s, but in the case of the Ctcc, it became clearly obvious in 1953 when federal government passed the Canadian Fair Employment Practices Act, a law that prohibited racial and religious discrimination in employment, but also in union affiliation. So when the bill was proposed, Catholic labor leaders forcefully denounced the fact that, I quote, their labor organization may suffer serious prejudice if not outlawed according to the actual wording of the law. So they asked the Section 4 of the bill to be amended to state that belonging to a faith-based organization would not be considered as a presumption of guilt. In the journal Le Travail, André Roy, the vice president of the organization, points out that Catholic unions have always been engaged in the defense of human rights and that the law goes against its own principles by attacking the rights to association. I want to note that many of my pictures today come from the Journal Le Travail, which was distributed among members in local unions since 1921 and still today, as the Ctcc is going to celebrate its 100th anniversary in 2021. So after several representations, the law was amended to eliminate presumption of guilt against Catholic unions, and its enactment was postponed so the Ctcc's affiliate can include the principle of non-discrimination in their statutes. But by enshrining this principle in Canadian law, the 1953 Federal Act brought to the forefront an old debate about the confessional status of the Ctcc and the place of the non-Catholic in this organization. So from the end of 1953 and on, what strikes me is that all Ctcc's leaders, including its president Gérard Picard, its secretary Jean Marchand, and even its Catholic chaplain Henri Pichette, made several speeches to affirm their support of the federal law and even ask provincial government to reinforce it in Quebec. This law was in fact a major argument for the campaign that they initiated at the time in favor of the secularization of their organization, which were also supported by the Catholic chaplain. So for example, in 1958, Gérard Picard wrote a long brief to the Assembly of Catholic Bishops of Quebec, where he abundantly relies on the 1953 Federal Act, but also on Universal Declaration, to emphasize the necessity for his organization to stop discriminating on a religious ground and to get away from what he called its potential racist color. In his brief, Picard also points out that this project is largely in phase with the evolution of International Confederation of Christian Unions, whose leaders also endorse secularism as a way to remove obstacles to its expansion in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, in the wake of anti-colonial struggles in the global South. So in 1960 annual convention, Ctcc's delegates voted in favor of secularization project that includes three things. So first, the withdrawal of Catholic doctrines from the statutes, the removal of all barriers, discriminatory barriers, and the modification of the organization's name, which will be renamed Confédération des Syndicats Nationaux, CSN. As in many other sectors of Quebec society at the time, debates on secularism were strongly articulated around issues related to human rights and discrimination. And I think that can explain some of the bizarre positions taken by many partisans of secularism in Quebec today. So in the case of the Ctcc, their massive use of universal rights discourse has created kind of a gap between their universality and the reality of structures and practice of their organization. I must also mention that these debates were going on with another one concerning the possible merger of the Ctcc with Canadian Labour Congress. And during this negotiation in the late 50s, a large part of discussion concerned the Ctcc's adherence to anti-discrimination principle and human rights. And it should be recalled that international unions at the instigation of Jewish Labour Committee, but also the Canadian Jewish Congress and other ethnic and racialized groups in Canada, has set up in the 40s national, provincial, and also local committees to fight against racism and discrimination. In Montreal, the Montreal Labour Committee for Human Rights was created in 1947 and really worked to create human rights networks in the 40s and 50s. But the Ctcc never formally participate in that committee, even if the member of the committee were invited in Catholic unions to distribute these kinds of pamphlets. You can look at the one on the right, vous appartenez à une minorité, you belong to a minority, to conduct workshops, screen filmings, and they were also invited as observers at the Ctcc annual convention. So it's not until 1958, in the context of debates on secularism and union merger, that the Ctcc participate officially for the first time on that committee. And that year, Catholic labor leaders co-organized a conference on human relations that was held every year by the committee in Montreal. Its representatives were invited to give lectures on workers' unity and on the origins of racist prejudice. I must say that they spoke mainly about religion and anti-Semitism. In 1958, the Ctcc also participated in the organization led by the Montreal Committee of the Quebec Conference, celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this local engagement was also stimulated by the evolution of global debates on racism in the late 50s. So from 1953 to the 60s, the Ctcc, then CSN, get involved in a campaign organized by the International Confederation of Christian Unions to protest against apartheid in South Africa at the UN, United Nations, but also at the International Labour Organization. The CSN also asked in 1963 the federal government in Canada to boycott importation from South Africa, and its delegates were also attending the International Labour Organization conference where was adopted the declaration concerning the apartheid in 1964. And also at the same time, like many members of CSN, like many Quebecers at the same time, began to follow closely the evolution of civil rights movement in the United States and to engage, but very timidly, in debates about the possible existence of anti-Black racism in Quebec. In 1963, the CSN and the so-called international unions take the lead of a large delegation of NGOs who appeared before the Quebec Parliament to demand the adoption of a Charter of Rights and anti-discrimination law. This delegation was described at the time as the largest coalition in Quebec history, which is mainly true. But what is unprecedented is that this coalition includes Protestant, Catholic, Anglophone, Francophone, students, feminists, and most importantly, representative of Quebec Jewish, Italian, and Black Quebecers community. So during the presentation of the brief, the delegates often referred to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also emphasized the links between the protection of French Canadian rights and of minority rights in Canada. The CSN of chaplain Henri Pichette was also mandated to explain the deep Christian foundation of human rights ideal. So this vast delegation was at the origin of the adoption of the first two anti-discrimination laws in Quebec, the Hotel Act in 1963 and the Employment Discrimination Act in 1964, which I'm going to be studying next month. At the same time, many members of the CSN get involved in many human rights groups, including the Ligue des Droits de l'Homme, which fight during the 60s to put the international human rights law principle into the agenda of this period known in Quebec as the Quiet Revolution. Today, the history of human rights struggle is largely unknown to historians and the general public in Quebec. And in spite of historical importance of the 1963 coalition and the first anti-discrimination laws, those are strictly unknown to Quebec historians and are still excluded from Quiet Revolution narratives, which are largely articulated around Quebecers' fight for self-determination. This lack of history and memory of human rights struggles has, in my view, a profound influence on Quebecers' representation of themselves and of their history, while many mistakenly portrayed the struggle for human rights as somehow external to French Canadians' tradition. My lecture of today shows that the history of human rights is also a Quebec history. But in Quebec, as elsewhere in the world, the history of human rights movement has always been marked by obstacles, by conflicts, by debates, since the international community affirmed in the preamble of the 1948 Universal Declaration that human rights, I quote, are the common standards of achievement for all peoples and all nations. Thank you.